Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, you are in Washington and I am in Hamburg on this 9th of June. But let me assure you I would much rather be where you are in all of my 220-pound splendor. So why I'm here with you only virtually? Well, a few weeks ago while I was at Stanford, I had an operation and I was gently advised not to travel across the Atlantic again until fully recuperated. And my virtual presence with you. My topic is the authoritarian temptation, an old one, might I say, in the history of modern Western thought. Western intellectuals and pundits have always had a soft spot for the despots of the 20th century. Among liberals and leftists, Stalin was adulated by George Bernard Shaw and Eric Ambler, Walter Duranty and Lincoln Steffens. In France, his literary fans were André Gide and Jean-Paul Sartre. On the right, Martin Heidegger, Ezra Pound, and Salvador Dali carried the torch of Hitler and or Mussolini. G.B. Shaw, by the way, was an equal opportunity FOD, friend of despots. So he cheered not only Stalin, but also Hitler. And by the way, Germany's professors and students were among the very first to defect to Hitler in 1933. So much for the extraordinary wisdom of intellectuals. In recent times, student revolutionaries around the world loved Che Guevara, though there was nothing lovable about him because he was always scheming and dreaming how to entangle the Soviet Union and the United States in a deadly nuclear war. So anyway, this quick survey suggests that the authoritarian temptation is a recurring fixture of Western thought. And interestingly enough, it remains a fixture even after the cosmic evil wrought by the totalitarians of the 20th century. Why is this so? Why does this fascination never die? Let me start by quoting a famous American columnist who was recently writing about China. Swooning over the high-speed rail link between Beijing and Shanghai, he noted that Amtrak couldn't even dream of covering the same distance in the same 5 hours. For the run between New York and Chicago, Amtrak used up to 18 hours. I can even top this. The new maglev train between Shanghai and its airport takes just a few minutes. That train was invented and prototyped in Germany, and one of them was supposed to connect Munich and its airport. But it wasn't built. It still takes 40 minutes by light rail. Another example from my hometown of Hamburg, under Hitler, the so-called flying hamburger train covered the distance between Berlin and Hamburg in 38 minutes. In democratic Germany, it took 66 years to match that record. So why? One word, democracy. So Bavaria's citizens revolted against the noise and the skyrocketing costs of the maglev train prevailing in the courts, as their compatriots along the Hamburg-Berlin route could not in the 30s. So the Bavarians mounted precisely the resistance that is impossible in authoritarian regimes. There's no rule of law in China, citizens can't fight the state, and cost is no object when it comes to national prestige. Now, of course, our Western fans of authoritarianism are well aware of this downside, namely the costs in terms of freedom, rule of law, and participation. But in the trade-off, they opt for the presumed efficiency, wisdom, and decisiveness of authoritarian regimes. So let's quote our pundit again. Quote, China has a political class focused on addressing its real problems as well as a mountain of savings with which to do so, unquote. So here you have the basic advantage, right, of authoritarian regimes. They have the will, they have the wherewithal, and why do they? Because the leaders of China et al. Don't have to deal with the messy, time-consuming business of democracy. Instead, to quote a pundit again, they, quote, get to spend more of their time focusing on how to build their nations, unquote. In other words, the message here is the authoritarians have what democracies don't: focus, purpose, and control over resources. They can command, whereas democrats can only cajole. They can do whatever has to be done without log rolling and horse trading and the interminable maneuvers of the democratic process. Admittedly, this does sound very exciting, but let's contrast the authoritarian temptation with the authoritarian reality now. The first thing we observe, and the most important one, is that top-down economics succeeds at first but fails later, as, for instance, the Soviet model shows. Or it doesn't even reach the takeoff point, as a long list of imitators from Nasser's Egypt to Castro's Cuba demonstrates. Nor are 21st century populist caudillos do better, as Argentina, Ecuador, Venezuela illustrate. They don't do well. That's the statistical truth. So how come authoritarian or guided organization plants the seeds of its own demise? The system moves mountains in its youth, but eventually hardens into a mountain range itself, stony, immovable, impenetrable. It empowers vested interests who, like privileged players throughout history, first ignore and then resist change, because it is a mortal threat to their status and income. This is the nature of every such society, which political economists call rent-seeking. In such a system, as Frank Fukuyama has pointed out, the elites are driven to either capture or co-opt political power in order to secure a rent for themselves, a rent meaning that is more riches than a free market would grant. And so the game is to convert public power into personal profit, dam markets and competition. So in East Asia, mind you, it's not only China, the game was played by both the state and the society, be it openly or underhanded, by underhanded give and take. So raising the banner of national advantage, the state favors industries, organized interests. In turn, these seek more power in order to gain monopolies, subsidies, tax breaks, and protection from competition, so as to increase their rents, which is, again, wealth and status above and beyond what a competitive system would deliver. Now, the larger the state, the richer the rents. If the state rather than the market determines economic outcomes, politics beats profitability any time. Any time as allocator of resources, licenses, building permits, capital, import barriers, anti-competitive regulations go to the state's own or to favored players, breeding corruption and inefficiency. Nor is such a system easily repaired. Because the state that grants all these goodies depends on its clients as a source of power and allegiance, just as these do depend on their mighty benefactor. So this widening web of collusion breeds either stagnation or revolt. The key moral of my tale here is that Authoritarian economic miracles never last. Take Japan, which pretty much invented the growth model that Taiwan, South Korea, and now China have been following. Take Japan, which riled the American soul to no end in the 80s and 90s. Now, Japan was not a dictatorship like South Korea, but it was de facto a one-party state way into the 90s of the last century, or even into the 21st century. One-party state run by the LDP. So a double-digit growth wunderkind after the war, it now looks back at 3 lost decades of stagnation. And at one point in the 60s and 70s, they had higher growth rates even than the Chinese. But so by the 1980s, to just dwell on this example for a moment, the US was in full paranoid uproar. What the Japanese hadn't been able to do with the aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor, they would now do their Toyotas and Panasonics. They would achieve world domination, America first. And today the hype about Japan could be applied verbatim, just changing the countries, to China, just change the names. Here's a typical paean sung by Time magazine about Japan in the 1980s, which you could easily substitute for contemporary China. So here it goes, quote, Japan's power elite practices what Americans can't do, the spirit of compromise and consensus. State-owned banks make low-interest loans to manufacturers. And private banks know that the government expects them to give easy credits. The government does not yield to the pleas of special interest groups. Bureaucrats and executives jointly manage policy. Both sides understand one another because their leaders usually have the same roots of culture and class. So just put in China and the quote holds a generation later. Here you have, in one short paragraph, you have all the awe that we tend to bestow on authoritarian modernizers. A culture that is not as messy and self-absorbed as the West's, harmony rather than conflict, guidance from above, no power to special interests, cheap capital by the state to favorite players. But ironically, these goodies are precisely the poison pills that doom the shiny authoritarian model in the long run. Initially, the system is very good for rapid initial growth because it rests on 4 pillars. 1, overinvestment due to cheap and ample state funds. Underconsumption as the counterpart to overinvestment. 3, cheap labor. 4, exports first. And finally, a systematically undervalued currency. Such modernitarian systems, as I call them, are very good at a very low level of development. Rampant early growth easy if you don't have to economize but can use factors extensively. Cheap labor from the countryside and cheap capital lavished by unfavored players by the state-dominated banking system. And thus, by the way, not just for China, thus for Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, it was double-digit growth first, stagnation, or low single-digit growth later. That is the historical story of authoritarian modernization. Now take a look at China today. The advantages of capitalism have virtually disappeared. China's growth rate, which had once climbed to an absolute peak of 15% in the late 80s, is now down to exactly 1/2. Why? Because initial strengths turn into long-term liabilities. Take overinvestment, which drives the growth machine at the very beginning. China spends an astounding 1/2 of GDP on investment, something no democratic nation could ever do. the equivalent figure is 10% in the United States. But overinvestment comes with its own curse. Because eventually it turns upon itself because of the oldest law of economics, which is the law of diminishing returns. To explain, buy one tractor for the farm and per acre yield soars. Buy 5 and each tractor investment contributes less and less. So by now we have some pretty good numbers about how the law of diminishing return has begun to bite in China. It tells us how each million yuan in investment creates, say, only 1/2 of the additional output it created in the 90s. That's curse number one. Number two, the second curse of rapid rise is a seemingly eternal cost advantage in manufacturing. In China, it has almost disappeared. Yes, it has almost disappeared. Why? Because with growth, Chinese wages have soared exponentially, and I mean exponentially, by about 19% per year in the last 10 years. American wages, by contrast, have grown only by 4% per year. So this normal course of events, where the initial wage advantage, which drives rapid growth, disappears as a country becomes richer, this normal course of events has been exacerbated by a third factor in the case of China, a deadly demography. The short take is this: China will be old before it becomes rich, which is a result of an authoritarian system that prescribed the one-child policy, cannot even think about immigration that will make up for the shortfall. So by the middle of this decade, practically today, a seemingly inexhaustible labor supply will begin to decline while the army of pensioners will grow by leaps and bounds. Now let's talk a little bit about the wrong politics of authoritarianism, which are also fated to cut into spectacular economic growth. All admirers of authoritarianism fall prey to the faulty premise of the trade-off between freedom and efficiency has to be resolved in favor of efficiency. Take away freedom and you will be richly rewarded by growth and efficiency. But this calculus doesn't work in the longer run, doesn't work there in the longer run. Surely parliamentary democracy and the rule of law set a obstacle against swift and decisive action. Let's take a closer look at the authoritarians. Instead of the rule of law and a level playing field, you have a supreme state. The state will invariably maintain its power by buying off privileged groups. Those in turn will use their privileged position for rent-seeking, as I said before. Like bacteria breed disease, this state will breed corruption for a simple but endemic reason. It is so much easier to cajole a bureaucrat in giving you licenses, permits, and protection from competition than making the best possible product that will be on the market by itself. So corruption is an enormous transaction tax that distorts markets and misallocates resources. Every other day you read about a spectacular case of corruption exposed in China, and that the regime will now tomorrow stamp it out for good. Finally, but the deadening symbiosis between state and economy is no accident. It is one of the oldest stories in the world. 500 years ago, Machiavelli mused, it's easier to get gold with good soldiers than good soldiers with gold. Let me translate that for you. Machiavelli meant to say that political power trumps it all. And that is why collusion, corruption, and rent-seeking is endemic in authoritarian states. A bureaucrat can become rich by selling favors, and a businessman can become even richer by having the state shower cheap capital and exclusive market shares on his enterprise. This is not economic efficiency as the admirers of authoritarianism think it is. system that systematically misallocates resources, breeds monopoly profits, and breaks innovation. Where does it go? Where does the money go? Under the mattress, abroad, or into millions of empty apartments? Indeed, China's financial system is a ticking time bomb. There are billions in non-performing loans. The banking system is or should be one huge bank. You don't need democratic capitalism to set off cosmic financial crisis, is the moral of this little tale. And we haven't even begun to tell you the political costs. The suppression of ideas and free enterprise, the rationing of information, the inequality that comes with party elite and their principles, the heavy hand of the authorities, and the ever-present threat of incarceration. So contrary to myth, and on a lighter note, the strongman can't even make the trains run on time. Check it out in Russia, check it out in Venezuela or Algeria. They can build maglev trains in defiance of resistance and budgetary prudence, but they cannot provide the setting where such trains, these maglev trains, move from dream to drawing board, from design to actual invention. And yet the authoritarian temptation, as I mentioned at the beginning, will never disappear. So let me quote our pundit again. I quoted at the beginning. One-party autocracy certainly has its drawbacks. But when it is led by a reasonably enlightened group of people, as China is today, it can also have great advantages, unquote. So this is the oldest dream in the West. Let's ditch our messy politics and entrust it to a benign and enlightened despot. Now, how many despots have actually ever remained benign and enlightened? Lord Acton famously answered, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I, in the end, do prefer the rule of law, checks and balances, accountability, transparency, and peaceful alternation in power. It works better in the long run, and because I have never met an authoritarian system that did not succumb to corruption, privilege, inequality, and ultimately stagnation. So in the trade-off, I take refuge in that old saw that you heard before, but which is quite apropos, in the old saw that says, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And why? Because it can be repaired. Despotic governments can only be silently suffered or utterly overthrown. Alas, I've also never met a Western society that is immune to the authoritarian temptation. So, in conclusion, like Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator, this temptation always says, I will be back. But I will stop. Thank you for listening to my disembodied presence. And I really wish I could have been with you, because if I were, we would now have a very lively debate that would undoubtedly enlighten and amuse me and stimulate me to no end. But alas, I'm too far away. So thank you for listening.